My foster son asked when I would start hitting him, and it destroyed me. The question hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday, right in the middle of chopping onions for dinner. I'm a software engineer. I solve problems for a living. But nothing in my 34 years had prepared me for the casual way 8-year-old Caleb asked when I was going to start hitting him. He stood in our kitchen doorway wearing the donated clothes from his social worker because he'd arrived with literally nothing 3 weeks earlier. His shoulders were hunched like he expected something terrible to happen at any moment, and his dark hair hung in his eyes the way kids do when they're trying to hide from the world. When I asked if he wanted to help me cook, he took a step backward and whispered those 9 words that made me set down my knife with hands that suddenly wouldn't stop shaking. The casualness in his voice was what destroyed me most, because he wasn't asking out of fear. He was asking like someone wondering when dinner would be ready. I turned to face him completely, keeping my distance because I'd learned over the past 3 weeks that Caleb didn't like adults getting too close without warning. He was staring at his feet, one sock higher than the other, wearing jeans that were too big, and a superhero t-shirt that had seen better days. I could see the tension in every muscle of his small frame, the way he positioned himself near the doorway where he could escape quickly if needed. My wife Sarah and I had been taking things slowly with him, following all the advice from Linda, our social worker, about giving traumatized children time to adjust, but nothing she'd told us had prepared us for this level of damage. I knelt down to his eye level, making sure to keep my movements slow and predictable, and said as gently as I could manage, "Caleb, I'm never going to hit you, ever. That's not something that happens in this house." The confusion that crossed his face made my heart break because he genuinely didn't understand what I meant. He looked up at me with brown eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who should have been worried about homework and video games and whether his favorite cartoon was on tonight. "But I've been really good for 3 whole weeks," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion that made me realize this wasn't about fear of punishment. "Usually, it starts by now when I get too comfortable. Am I supposed to do something bad first to remind you?" The matter-of-fact way he said it hit me like a physical blow, because he wasn't asking when I would hit him because he was afraid it would happen. He was asking because in his experience, it always happened, and he was trying to figure out the rules of our house so he could prepare himself mentally for the inevitable violence. The clinical detachment in his 8-year-old voice suggested he'd learned to disconnect emotionally from these experiences as a survival mechanism, and that realization made me want to throw up right there on our kitchen floor. Sarah came through the front door right then with grocery bags in both hands, calling out her usual, "I'm home." My favorite people, in the cheerful voice she'd been using to try to make Caleb feel welcome. I watched him immediately tense up and move closer to the wall, positioning himself where he could see both of us at the same time and monitor our movements. Over the past 3 weeks, I'd noticed this pattern, but hadn't understood what it meant until right now. He wasn't just being cautious around new adults, he was calculating escape routes and assessing threat levels like a tiny soldier in a war zone. Sarah walked into the kitchen with a smile that faded immediately when she saw the expression on my face, and Caleb pressed against the wall like he was trying to disappear into the paint. She set the grocery bags down carefully and looked between us with the concerned expression she got when one of us was hurt or upset. "Everything okay in here?" she asked, keeping her voice soft and calm the way we'd both learned to do around Caleb. I explained what Caleb had asked me, watching Sarah's face go through the same progression of shock, confusion, and heartbreak that I was still processing. Caleb stood silently during this entire exchange, probably reading our facial expressions and body language to try to figure out what they meant for his immediate safety and long-term survival in our house. When I finished explaining, Sarah looked at Caleb with the gentlest expression I'd ever seen on her face, the same look she got when she was treating injured animals at the veterinary clinic where she worked. She sat down at our kitchen table instead of walking closer to him, making herself less physically imposing by lowering her height and removing herself as a potential threat. "Caleb, can I ask you something?" she said in the same voice she used with scared puppies. He nodded once, barely perceptibly. "In the places you lived before, did the grown-ups hit you when you did something wrong, or did they hit you sometimes even when you were being good?" "Both," Caleb said without any hesitation whatsoever, like he was reciting his address or phone number. "Mrs. Garrett said kids need to stay scared so they stay grateful. She hit me when I was bad, but also when I was good, so I wouldn't get lazy or disrespectful. She said, if you're not scared anymore, that means you're getting too comfortable, and comfortable kids become selfish kids." The clinical way he described systematic psychological and physical abuse made me realize we weren't dealing with a caregiver who'd lost control or had anger management issues. This was calculated, methodical conditioning designed to keep a child in a constant state of fear and hypervigilance. Mrs. Garrett had created a deliberate system where Caleb could never predict safety, which meant he could never truly relax or feel secure anywhere. My mind started racing back through the past 3 weeks, reinterpreting every behavior I'd observed through this new, horrifying lens. His refusal to sit on our furniture, preferring to stand or sit on the floor where he could move quickly, the way he ate every meal like someone might snatch his food away at any moment, how he never asked for anything, even when he was clearly cold or thirsty or needed to use the bathroom. Sarah and I exchanged glances over Caleb's head, both of us thinking the same thing without needing to say it out loud. This wasn't just abuse. This was systematic conditioning designed to produce a specific type of behavioral outcome. Mrs. Garrett hadn't been punishing bad behavior. She'd been training Caleb to expect violence as a normal part of adult-child relationships. "What other kinds of reminders did she give you?" I asked as gently as I could manage, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. My engineering brain was already trying to catalog and understand the system she'd used, but my heart was screaming at the idea that someone had deliberately tortured this little boy. Caleb looked between Sarah and me like he was assessing whether this was a trick question or if we were gathering information to use against him later. After what felt like an eternity, he started talking in that same emotionally disconnected voice, describing punishments that made my hands clench into fists under the table, hair pulling when he laughed too loudly or seemed too happy, pinching when he asked questions or seemed curious about things, ice-cold baths when he cried or showed any emotional vulnerability, being locked in a dark closet for hours when he appeared too comfortable around adults, or asked for things he needed like food or water. Mrs. Garrett had developed an entire methodology for breaking down children's natural resilience and replacing it with learned helplessness and terror. She had a point system where different behaviors earned different levels of punishment, and she'd apparently shared this system with other foster parents in some kind of informal network. The fact that this was systematic rather than impulsive made it infinitely more disturbing because it meant she'd put thought and planning into the most effective ways to psychologically torture children in her care. I stood up slowly and walked to our kitchen junk drawer where we kept takeout menus, rubber bands, and random household items. I pulled out a small notebook and a pen, then sat back down at the table and started writing down everything Caleb was telling us. He watched this process with obvious interest and growing anxiety, clearly trying to figure out what I was documenting and what it might mean for him. "I'm writing down everything you're telling us," I explained, "not because you're in trouble or because we don't believe you, but because we need to remember all of these details so we can help protect other kids who might be going through similar situations. The people whose job it is to keep children safe need to know what Mrs. Garrett was doing so they can make sure she never gets to hurt anyone else." The idea that his information could help protect other children seemed to resonate with Caleb in a way that promises about his own safety hadn't, probably because he'd learned not to trust adult promises, but he could still care about other kids suffering. Once Caleb realized we were taking his experiences seriously and weren't going to punish him for talking about them, he started providing more details about Mrs. Garrett's operation. She had multiple children in her house at any given time, rotating them through the system as they either aged out or were moved to other placements for various reasons. She ran what she called a gratitude training program, where children had to earn basic necessities like food, blankets, and bathroom privileges by demonstrating sufficient fear and compliance. She took before and after photos of children to document how her methods changed their behavior over time, apparently sharing these photos with other adults in her network as proof that her techniques were effective. She had detailed charts tracking each child's punishments, behavioral modifications, and progress through her program. The basement of her house had been converted into isolation cells, where children were kept for extended periods as punishment, and she'd installed soundproofing so neighbors wouldn't hear crying or screaming. As Caleb continued talking, I realized we were dealing with something far more extensive and organized than individual child abuse. This wasn't one disturbed foster parent losing control. This was a sophisticated operation involving multiple adults who had developed systematic methods for breaking children's spirits and conditioning them for specific purposes. The fact that there was a network of foster parents sharing techniques and documentation suggested this had been going on for years, possibly decades, with children cycling through the system while state agencies conducted perfunctory check-ins that never revealed the systematic abuse happening behind closed doors. Either the oversight system was failing catastrophically through incompetence, or someone within the system was actively covering up what was happening. Neither possibility was acceptable, but both suggested the problem was much bigger than just Mrs. Garrett. That night after Caleb went to bed, Sarah and I sat at our kitchen table with my notebook spread between us, trying to process everything we'd learned and figure out what our next steps should be. The list of abuses was 4 pages long, written in my neat engineering handwriting, organized into categories like physical punishments, psychological manipulation tactics, environmental deprivation, and what I'd labeled conditioning protocols. Looking at it laid out systematically like this made the scope of the abuse crystal clear, but it also revealed the methodical nature of what Mrs. Garrett had been doing. This wasn't random violence or emotional instability. This was calculated psychological torture designed to produce specific behavioral outcomes in vulnerable children. She wasn't just an abusive caregiver. She was running some kind of systematic operation with multiple participants and clear objectives. Sarah made coffee even though it was almost midnight because neither of us was going to sleep anyway, and we started researching everything we could find online about systematic child abuse, trafficking networks, and institutional failures in the foster care system. What we found kept us up until dawn and made us both sick to our stomachs. Stories of organized networks that placed traumatized children with specially trained foster parents who conditioned them for various purposes, including labor trafficking, sexual exploitation, and medical experimentation. Documentation of state agencies that ignored obvious warning signs for years because removing children from profitable placements would disrupt funding streams. Cases where entire networks of foster parents, social workers, judges, and state officials worked together to protect abusive operations while children suffered in plain sight. The next morning, I called Linda before I even had breakfast and asked for an emergency meeting. She came to our house that afternoon while Caleb was at school, bringing another social worker named Tom who specialized in institutional abuse cases. I handed Linda my notebook and watched her face change as she read through 4 pages of systematically documented abuse. When she finished reading, she sat in our living room chair for several minutes without saying anything, probably trying to reconcile what she was reading with her knowledge of Mrs. Garrett and the foster care system she'd worked in for over 15 years. Finally, she looked up at Sarah and me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between horror and professional determination. "I need to ask you both something, and please answer honestly," she said. "Are you absolutely certain Caleb isn't exaggerating any of this or creating false memories to get attention? Children who've experienced trauma sometimes elaborate on events or create stories that aren't entirely accurate." The question made me angry because it suggested she was looking for reasons not to believe him rather than reasons to investigate further. "Linda, look at how he behaves," Sarah said firmly. "The hypervigilance, the way he positions himself in rooms so he can monitor multiple adults simultaneously, his refusal to sit on furniture or ask for things he needs. That's not normal childhood anxiety or attention-seeking behavior. That's trauma conditioning from systematic abuse over an extended period of time." I showed her photos I'd taken of Caleb's positioning in various rooms over the past 3 weeks, always near exits, always where he could see multiple adults at once, never relaxing or letting his guard down, even when he was supposedly safe. The behavioral evidence supported everything he'd told us, and the systematic nature of his responses suggested conditioning rather than random trauma. Linda studied the photos and my documentation, then made phone calls from our kitchen while Sarah and I waited in the living room, listening to her voice get increasingly strained as she talked to supervisors and investigators. After an hour of phone calls, Linda came back with Tom and told us they were opening an immediate investigation into Mrs. Garrett's foster home and potentially several other homes in her network. But then Linda said something that made my blood run cold and confirmed my worst fears about the scope of what we were dealing with. Caleb hadn't been the only child removed from Mrs. Garrett's home recently. 4 other children had been moved to different placements in the past 8 months, all for what the official files labeled behavioral issues and difficulty adjusting to foster care. None of these children had been interviewed about their experiences with Mrs. Garrett, and their new placements had been told they were dealing with naturally difficult or traumatized children who needed extra patience and understanding. "What kind of behavioral issues?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on everything Caleb had told us about Mrs. Garrett's conditioning methods. Linda checked her notes and read off a list that sounded like textbook symptoms of severe trauma rather than behavioral problems. Aggressive outbursts when adults approached unexpectedly, inability to sleep through the night due to nightmares and hypervigilance, hoarding food and hiding it in their rooms or clothes, inappropriate fear responses to normal parenting activities like discipline or affection, difficulty forming emotional attachments with new caregivers despite being placed in loving homes. Every single symptom could be explained by the conditioning protocols Caleb had described, suggesting that Mrs. Garrett had been systematically breaking children's spirits and then sending them into the system labeled as problematic when her abuse had made them unable to function normally. The investigation team went to Mrs. Garrett's house that same evening, while we waited by the phone for updates. Linda called us at 8:30 p.m. with preliminary findings that made me sit down hard on our kitchen floor because my legs literally wouldn't support me anymore. They'd found detailed records that Mrs. Garrett had been keeping for over 3 years, documenting each child's punishments, tracking their behavioral modifications, and noting their progress through what she officially called her Gratitude and Resilience Training Program. She had professional-looking charts on the walls of a basement office showing point systems for different children, behavioral modification schedules, and punishment escalation protocols. She'd been taking systematic before and after photos to document how her methods changed children's behavior over time, apparently sharing these photos with other adults in her network as evidence that her techniques were producing desired results. But the worst discovery was what they found in the basement. Linda's voice actually cracked as she described the isolation rooms that Mrs. Garrett had constructed. Multiple small, windowless spaces with locks on the outside where children were kept for extended periods as punishment for various infractions. The walls had scratch marks from fingernails where children had tried to claw their way out, and some had writing carved into the wood with improvised tools. Children's names, dates, desperate messages like, "Help me," and "I want to go home," and "Please let me out." The investigation team was treating the entire house as a crime scene, and had called in specialists from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit because the systematic nature of the abuse suggested organized criminal activity rather than individual child abuse. Linda called again Saturday morning with news that made everything infinitely worse and confirmed my darkest suspicions about what we were really dealing with. Mrs. Garrett's background check documents were completely falsified. Her foster parent training certificates were forged. Her references were paid actors who'd been coached on what to say during phone interviews with state agencies. She'd been operating under a stolen identity for over 4 years while systematically abusing children and collecting monthly stipends from the state for their care. But the most disturbing discovery was that she wasn't working alone. The FBI had found evidence of communication with at least 12 other fake foster parents operating in similar ways across 4 different states, sharing techniques, photos, and what appeared to be systematic methods for breaking children's psychological resistance. Detective Miles Hoffman from the county police called us Saturday afternoon and asked if he could interview Caleb about his experiences. Hoffman specialized in organized child abuse cases and needed detailed information about Mrs. Garrett's methods to support criminal charges and identify other victims. We explained the situation to Caleb, emphasizing that he wasn't in trouble and that talking to Detective Hoffman might help protect other children who were still trapped in similar situations. Caleb agreed to the interview, but insisted that Sarah and I stay in the room with him, positioning himself at our kitchen table where he could see all 3 adults simultaneously while maintaining escape routes to multiple exits. His strategic positioning reminded me that despite being only 8 years old, Caleb had developed sophisticated survival skills that most adults never needed. Detective Hoffman had clearly done this type of interview before, because he started with completely non-threatening questions about Caleb's favorite foods, movies, and hobbies, before gradually shifting to more serious topics about his experiences with Mrs. Garrett. Caleb answered everything in that same emotionally detached voice I'd heard before, describing systematic abuse and conditioning like he was reciting multiplication tables or explaining the rules of a board game. Hoffman took detailed notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions, but mostly he just listened while Caleb described 3 years of systematic torture designed to break his spirit and condition him to accept violence as normal and inevitable. After 2 hours, Hoffman had documented enough evidence to support multiple felony charges against Mrs. Garrett and probable cause to investigate her entire network. The breaking point in the interview came when Detective Hoffman asked about other children who had been in Mrs. Garrett's house during Caleb's time there. Caleb's detached demeanor cracked for the first time as he started talking about a little girl named Sophie who'd been there when he first arrived. Sophie was 6 years old when Caleb met her, and she'd already been in Mrs. Garrett's care for over 18 months. Caleb described how Sophie had stopped speaking entirely after months of punishment for asking questions or expressing any kind of curiosity about the world around her. She communicated only through nods, head shakes, and basic hand gestures because talking had been systematically conditioned out of her through increasingly severe punishments. Mrs. Garrett apparently considered Sophie's silence a success story and used her as an example to newer children about what proper gratitude and compliance looked like. "Where is Sophie now?" Detective Hoffman asked gently, though I could see in his expression that he was preparing for an answer none of us wanted to hear. Caleb's face went completely blank, and he stopped talking for several minutes, staring at his hands folded in his lap. When he finally whispered his answer, the words hit the room like a physical blow that sucked all the air out of our lungs. "She got too sad and couldn't be fixed anymore. Mrs. Garrett said she was broken and had to go away to a special place for kids who couldn't learn to be grateful." Hoffman asked what "going away" meant, and Caleb said he didn't know because one morning Sophie just wasn't in her room anymore, and Mrs. Garrett told everyone she'd been sent somewhere better suited for children who couldn't handle proper training. Hoffman and Linda exchanged glances that made my stomach drop, because I could see they were thinking the same thing I was. If Mrs. Garrett had been keeping detailed records and behavioral charts for multiple children over several years, but Sophie wasn't among the children who'd been moved to other foster placements, then where was she? Hoffman asked Caleb if he remembered exactly when Sophie disappeared, and Caleb said it was right after Halloween, because she'd asked Mrs. Garrett if they would get candy like other kids, and that question had earned her 2 weeks in the basement isolation room. When she came out, she was different, barely responsive and unable to eat solid food. A few days later, she was gone forever, and Mrs. Garrett told everyone never to mention her name again, because talking about broken children would make the others weak and ungrateful. The investigation expanded dramatically that afternoon when Detective Hoffman's team discovered the full scope of Mrs. Garrett's operation and the network of fake foster parents she'd been coordinating with. They found encrypted communications with what appeared to be buyers who were purchasing psychologically broken, compliant children for various purposes, including domestic slavery, sexual exploitation, and medical experimentation. The basement isolation rooms weren't just punishment cells, they were conditioning facilities designed to produce children who would never fight back, never try to escape, and never tell anyone what was being done to them. Mrs. Garrett wasn't just an abusive foster parent. She was running a sophisticated child trafficking operation that had been functioning for years while collecting payments from both the state foster care system and private buyers. By Sunday evening, the FBI had taken over the investigation completely and were treating it as organized human trafficking with potential victims in multiple states. Mrs. Garrett's network included at least 15 fake foster parents, several social workers who were either complicit or compromised, and what appeared to be buyers from across the country who were purchasing conditioned children for specific purposes. The systematic nature of the operation suggested years of planning and coordination, with each fake foster parent specializing in different aspects of the conditioning process before children were moved to buyers or eliminated if they couldn't be broken properly. Sophie's disappearance was looking less like a placement transfer and more like evidence disposal. Detective Hoffman called us Sunday night after Caleb was asleep with news that confirmed our worst fears about Sophie's fate. Search teams with cadaver dogs had found human remains buried in the woods behind Mrs. Garrett's property, including what appeared to be the remains of at least 3 children who'd been buried at different times over the past 2 years. The medical examiner's preliminary findings suggested death by systematic starvation and exposure, probably while being kept in the basement isolation rooms for extended periods as punishment for behavioral infractions or resistance to conditioning. Mrs. Garrett hadn't been placing difficult children in other homes. She'd been murdering them and burying the evidence while continuing to collect state payments for their care. Mrs. Garrett was arrested Monday morning at her house and charged with multiple counts of murder, systematic child abuse and torture, human trafficking, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The state immediately suspended all foster placements statewide while conducting emergency reviews of every licensed foster home, but the damage had already been done to dozens of children over several years. Detective Hoffman warned us that Mrs. Garrett was definitely not working alone, and that this type of organized trafficking operation typically involved corruption within state agencies, law enforcement, and judicial systems. The investigation was expanding to include anyone who might have facilitated or covered up the operation, which meant Caleb might need to testify in multiple trials over the coming years. The scope of the criminal network became clear over the following weeks, as FBI raids in 4 states uncovered similar operations involving over 40 fake foster parents and hundreds of victim children. Some children had been sold to buyers and would need to be located and rescued. Others had been murdered when they couldn't be broken properly or became too difficult to control. The operation had been generating millions of dollars annually through a combination of state foster care payments and private sales of conditioned children to buyers who wanted psychologically broken, compliant victims for various purposes. The systematic nature of the abuse and the coordination between multiple fake foster parents suggested this wasn't just criminal opportunism, it was organized evil on an industrial scale. Caleb's behavior started making even more sense as details of the investigation emerged through Detective Hoffman's updates and media coverage. His expectation that we would eventually hit him wasn't based on normal child abuse experiences or even severe neglect. It was based on systematic conditioning designed to make him accept violence as inevitable and normal while breaking down his psychological resistance to being controlled by adults. Mrs. Garrett had been preparing him for sale to buyers who wanted children who wouldn't fight back, wouldn't try to escape, and wouldn't tell anyone what was being done to them. The gratitude training program was actually psychological warfare designed to make children grateful for basic survival while accepting that they deserved punishment for existing. The state offered us immediate adoption placement for Caleb after Linda explained that keeping him in the foster system during the investigation and trials would be traumatic and potentially dangerous if other network members were still operating. Sarah and I had been discussing adoption since the investigation started because we both realized Caleb needed permanent stability and security rather than continued uncertainty about his future. The paperwork was expedited because of the special circumstances, and we were able to finalize everything within 6 weeks instead of the usual months-long process. When we told Caleb about the adoption, his first question was whether we'd be legally allowed to hit him once the papers were signed, which broke my heart all over again, but also showed how deeply the conditioning had affected his understanding of adult-child relationships. The criminal trials began 8 months later, with Caleb testifying via closed-circuit video from a specially designed room at the courthouse that was set up to be non-threatening for child witnesses. Sarah and I sat with him during his testimony, along with Dr. Rachel Kim, the trauma specialist who'd been working with him twice a week since the investigation started. Caleb described Mrs. Garrett's conditioning methods in detail, explaining how she'd systematically broken down his resistance and taught him that questioning adults or expressing needs was dangerous. His testimony was crucial evidence that helped prosecutors secure life sentences for Mrs. Garrett and 12 other network members, though several suspects, including potential buyers, were still at large. The trials revealed the full scope of what investigators were calling the largest organized child trafficking ring in U.S. history, with evidence of over 200 victim children across multiple states and millions of dollars in profits from both state payments and private sales. Some children had been recovered alive and were receiving specialized trauma treatment, but others had been murdered and their remains were still being found at properties connected to the network. The operation had been functioning for over a decade, while state agencies conducted routine inspections that never detected the systematic abuse happening in plain sight. Multiple state officials were indicted for negligence, corruption, or active participation in covering up evidence. Sarah and I started receiving updates from Dr. Kim about other children who'd been rescued from the network and were beginning their own recovery processes. Some were too psychologically damaged to ever fully recover, while others were making remarkable progress with specialized trauma therapy and placement in carefully screened adoptive families. Several older children who'd been sold to buyers were found during FBI raids and were helping investigators identify other victims and network participants. The recovery process for all these children would take years and require resources that most state systems weren't equipped to provide, but advocacy groups were pushing for federal funding to support specialized treatment programs. 3 years after that first devastating question in our kitchen, Caleb still checks the locks on our house every night before bed and sleeps with his bedroom door open so he can hear if anyone comes into the house. But he also laughs at my terrible dad jokes, argues with Sarah about bedtime like any normal 11-year-old, and gets excited about birthday parties and holiday celebrations. Dr. Kim says his recovery has been remarkable, considering the severity and duration of the abuse he experienced, though the conditioning will probably affect his stress responses for the rest of his life. Sometimes he still asks when we're going to start hitting him, usually after he's done something he thinks might be wrong, but now he asks because he needs reassurance rather than because he expects violence. The question that destroyed me 3 years ago ended up saving over 200 children from systematic trafficking and abuse. Caleb's courage in speaking about his experiences helped law enforcement dismantle the largest organized child trafficking network in U.S. history, and resulted in new federal legislation requiring enhanced oversight of foster care placements. But mostly, it gave one 8-year-old boy the chance to discover that some adults actually keep children safe instead of hurting them, and that families can be built on love and protection rather than fear and control. The investigation changed laws, saved lives, and brought justice to hundreds of victims. But for me, the most important outcome was watching Caleb learn to trust that he was finally, permanently safe. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.